When you back an animal into a corner, it will attack. Kim Jong-un is an animal. His politics form the sharpest 90-degree angle of contemporary geopolitics, and his isolationism backs that regime right into the edge. Time is running out for North Korea, and its totalitarian capo has nearly exhausted all of his options. The vultures are gathering. They smell the famine, and they sense the end. More importantly though, other world leaders are beginning to sense the same. I predict that the Korean Peninsula is on the precipice of dramatic change and that Kim Jong-un's regime is facing an existential threat. I do make this prediction at the risk of marking myself as a fool, since it seems that every month for the last decade the news cycle extrapolates imminent nuclear war with the North Koreans, and yet here we all are. It's to the point where it's difficult to take any reporting on North Korea seriously anymore. To me, articles on the subject have become nothing more than fear-mongering clickbait. However, I believe that the East Asian totalitarian regime will not survive many more winters, and there are multiple indications of this. The first indication lies within the Trump administration. If you paid attention to the election cycle and Trump's post-election rhetoric since, you may have noticed an ominous change concerning North Korea. During the election, it was a topic that barely came up at all within his speeches, interviews, or foreign policy proposals. Almost immediately after he began receiving classified briefings, though, the issue became much more discussed both directly and indirectly. And what I mean by that is that since becoming president, he has made several central arguments on North Korea, but to me, the most revealing indications come from his indirect statements made in an almost unintentional manner. He has made references to the hostile regime multiple times in this way, but the one that pops into my mind right now is the press conference where he kept referencing North Korea when asked completely unrelated questions. For example, he was asked about the leaked phone calls with Mexico and Australia early on in his presidency and answered something like, "Oh, that's terrible that it was leaked, but it wasn't that important. What happens though when I'm dealing with the problem of North Korea?" In that same event, I think he was asked about his plans in Syria and the wider Middle East, and he said something along the lines of, "Oh, I don't want to be one of those guys that says, yes, here's what we're going to do. I don't want to have to do that. I don't even want to tell you what I'm going to be doing in North Korea." To me, indirect statements like those are much more telling than a formal proclamation by the president stating, "We will get tough on North Korea and we will never allow them to have ICBMs." Or whatever other bullshit headline PR quote that the US government has been recycling for years. I'm 100% convinced that Donald Trump has classified information on Kim Jong-un that is much more dangerously imminent than we can imagine. This is speculative, but again, it's based on his dramatic change in rhetoric on the subject when comparing the time prior to him receiving intelligence briefings and the time after. Another factor that contributes to the likelihood of the collapse of Kim Jong-un's regime is the fluctuant situation and shifting geopolitical interests in the region, which necessarily impacts North Korea's role and importance. Take, for example, the recent impeachment of South Korea's president, Park Geun-hye. This is obviously going to create a temporary period of minor instability. It also ushers in uncertainty about the new leader's attitude towards the hostile neighbors in the north. Now, I told myself that I would stop getting sidetracked in these political rants, but I can't help but talking a bit more about Park Geun-hye, because the whole story surrounding her life and impeachment is just so bizarre and interesting, and really, the story actually starts with her father, Park Chung-hee. Now, after the Japanese surrendered in World War II, the Korean Peninsula was divided into the north and south, based on areas occupied by the Soviets and the Americans respectively. The Cairo Declaration makes it clear that a reunification was intended, but as the Cold War tensions escalated, that never really happened. There was already significant ideologic differences between the North and the South dating back to ancient times, but foreign occupation by the Soviet Union and the United States only polarized the two regions even more, such that the two governments we know today came into separate existence. In the north, Kim Il-sung took power, propelling his dynasty into absolute power, and I'll come back and talk about him in a little bit, but in the south, the anti-communist Syngman Rhee seized control, and he ruled until about 1960. He basically kept winning re-elections and amended the constitution so that he could keep running. But in April of 1960, the people protested and claimed that the election was rigged, so the CIA flew him the fuck out of there to Hawaii, where he later died. But it was during this time that Park Chung-hee came in, because during that time of instability, he used his influence as a general to successfully pull off a coup and rule South Korea as a dictatorship. He actually worked miracles for the South Korean economy and rescued it from third world status by becoming a significant export power, but he was very restrictive on the issues of civil liberties. The guy was constantly repelling assassination attempts as well, both from within and from the North Koreans. In fact, this is where the recently impeached president Park Geun-hye comes into the story, because during one of these assassination attempts, her mother was actually killed in the crossfires during a ceremony of South Korean Independence Day. Okay, and this is where things start to get really bizarre. Park Geun-hye was in her early 20s when this happened and became crippled with grief. One of her father's associates named Choi Tae-min approached her at that time and told her that he was seeing her dead mother in dreams, telling him to take care of Park Geun-hye. He used this to develop an influencing relationship not only with her but also her father. Choi Tae-min was this really off-the-wall character who was originally a Buddhist monk, but then merged Catholic teaching with Buddhist philosophy to start a cult called the Church of Eternal Life, and proclaimed himself to be the new Buddha. And from there he basically took on a role equivalent to that of Rasputin. Just like the Russian mystic exerted overwhelming control over the Romanov family and Russian politics, so too did this Korean shaman gain influence and power through the Park family. There are all sorts of strange and speculative rumors, including that he may have had a sexual relationship with Park Geun-hye. Either way, leaked documents from the South Korean embassy affirmed that whatever the details were, one thing was certain. Choi Tae-min had near complete control of the Park family and was using his influence to enact politics and enrich his family. In fact, in 1979, the director of the Korean Central Intelligence Agency assassinated Park Chung-hee and stated that part of the reasons were that Park failed to stop the corruptions of Choi Tae-min and failed to keep him away from his daughter. So here we have a woman becoming the South Korean president in 2013 who was the daughter of a military dictator who took power through a coup, a woman whose both parents were assassinated, and a woman who had been under significant influence from a shamanistic cult leader during the formative decades of her life. The story doesn't stop there because Park Geun-hye had also formed a relationship with Choi Tae-min's daughter, Choi Soon-sil, and this is ultimately the relationship that led to her impeachment. Though the investigations are ongoing, it has become clear that Choi Soon-sil has been exerting her influence on South Korean politics for years. In fact, the more that comes out, the more it looks like that Park was only a proxy for the real ruler of the country, Choi Soon-sil. Not only that, she was able to use her position to siphon tens of millions out of government coffers for her personal use. The whole story is going to make a great movie one day. Choi tried to remain out of the public spotlight, but she was always by Park's side. In 2006, Park was attacked with a razor blade, and it was Choi who went to the hospital to be with her. In fact, after her discharge, she received ongoing treatment at Choi's sister's house. Now, after all of this, you're probably expecting some dramatic conclusion to the story, and here it is. After Choi Soon-sil's arrest, she told reporters, quote, "I committed a sin that deserves death. Investigations, like I said, are ongoing, but damn, better than any fiction any person could write." Now, getting back to North Korea, the reason why the impeachment of Park Geun-hye is so important is because, again, it creates a temporary period of uncertainty. In order to deal with the threat of North Korea, it will require the cooperation of many players involved in the game of geopolitics. It will require the input of the United States, of China, Russia, of South Korea, and others. The point here is that the next leader of South Korea will play a critical role in the ultimate fate of North Korea, because the change in power presents a perfect opportunity for the country to re-examine its foreign policy and long-term strategy. Unfortunately, the frontrunners for the presidency there all appear to be little cupcakes with a submissive attitude towards King Jong-un. As another aside here, one of the top contenders there, named Lee Jae-myung, this guy calls himself the Korean Bernie Sanders, just so you get an idea of what he's like. His great idea on dealing with the North Koreans is to reach out to the North Korean dictatorship and try to understand their poor little feelings, and expel American troops from South Korea because they may be offending the North. Certainly there has been significant escalations in the region over the last year, especially since Trump took office, but I try not to read too much into that because it's nothing new. For as long as I can remember, tensions with the North Koreans have experienced many cycles of rapid escalations in the past that ultimately led to nothing. The general formula that these cycles follow is that the North Koreans will spew aggressive rhetoric and the United States will reciprocate. Then there will be some muscle flexing through missile testing, most of which seems to fail, and again the United States will return the favor by flexing its muscles, usually by staging military exercises with the South Koreans or mobilizing military assets in the area, forcing more aggressive rhetoric from the totalitarian regime, and the cycle just repeats itself. In 2017, the entire cycle has already played itself out at least once, and it begins with anti-American bombast coming from Kim Jong-un as per usual, which was returned in kind. This was followed by at least 4 significant missile tests this year, starting with the February launch of the KN-15 missile into the Sea of Japan. Probably the most consequential launch so far, though, was in early March, where 4 out of 5 medium-range missiles successfully traveled over 600 miles into the Sea of Japan. This was just 200 miles from Japanese shores. Then, of course, there was a failed launch in March, followed by another failed launch ahead of Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit to the United States. The international community led by the United States responded to all of this predictably with military posturing. There was a significant increase in the biannual military exercises conducted with the South Koreans this year, in which about 17,000 American troops, 300,000 South Koreans, and even forces from Australia and New Zealand practiced a blitzkrieg invasion of the North. The United States has also mobilized drones and elite covert units in the area, and I'll say this, Kim Jong-un is completely helpless against American drones and their Hellfire missiles. With the proper reconnaissance, the US could blast his pudgy ass to another dimension decisively if it did not have to worry about the geopolitical consequences from other key players in the region. These drones could also be used effectively to cripple North Korean missile sites and laboratories. More significantly, the US has moved an aircraft carrier to the Korean Peninsula, the USS Carl Vinson, and its THAAD missiles in response to North Korea's successful launch into the Sea of Japan in March. Now, THAAD was a system that was developed during the Gulf War in the 90s to counter Iraqi missiles during the conflict, and when it was first implemented, the failure rate was quite high, but as the engineering progressed in the 2000s, it has shown a very high success rate in shooting down short and medium-range missiles. This is based on publicly released information, so really there's no way to determine how effective the system really is at stopping possible attacks. That certainly did not stop the Chinese from condemning these actions from the United States though, because they fear it infringes on their local interests. Honestly, we probably don't even need a missile defense system in the area with how North Korea's test launches have been so abysmal as of late, and I bet a lot of money that the United States Armed Forces and intelligence arms have the situation on complete lockdown, such that if the word was given, they could completely decimate the North within hours before they even knew what was going on. I also don't think that the high failure rate of North Korean missile tests is a coincidence. It's very probable that the West has infiltrated their cyber infrastructure and are affecting these launches, at least in some of the cases, although this is purely speculative on my part. The problem with the militaristic stance of North Korea and its ICBM and nuclear programs is that it is utterly incompatible with their isolationist foreign policy. Education, communication, and the free flow of ideas are what drive technological progress, and when Kim Jong-un suppresses and goes as far as punishing all three, he is only preventing himself from modernizing his military technology and achieving his goal of developing the capability of delivering a nuclear warhead on an intercontinental ballistic missile, and this is really highlighting a fundamental problem of the North Korean regime and why it will never reach any form of zenith. Culturally, they have always had bad leadership trying to reconcile an aggressive military strategy with horrible domestic and foreign policy. They have failed and will continue to fail. The real tragedy is the millions of North Koreans who have to suffer and starve to death as a result. In order to fully comprehend this though, it's worth discussing some of the history of North Korea. Korean history is a fascinating topic in itself, and I'll try to only scratch the surface here as to not get too sidetracked, but basically, ancient Korean history centers around multiple kingdoms that rose to prominence and then fell. The first such kingdom was that of Kojoseon, which according to legend was founded by the grandson of the heavens, Tangun, at around 2300 BC. The capital of his kingdom was allegedly established near modern-day Pyongyang, and you can see how some of the ancient history already begins to shape North Korean nationalism. Kim Il-sung declared that Tangun was an actual historical figure and sent North Korean archaeologists all over the place on a mission to discover Tangun's tomb. They did find some burial sites and were quick to attribute it to the ancient divine leader. Really, this is no different than medieval European rulers using religion for political motives. In the same way, the Kim dynasty can use the legend of Tangun to propagate fierce nationalism and obedience. The kingdom of Kojoseon thrived for nearly 2 millennia until it was finally conquered by the Han dynasty at around 100 BC, and after a period of instability, 3 distinct kingdoms emerged within the Korean Peninsula. These were the kingdoms of Bakche and Shilla in the south, and Koguryu in the north. Now what's really interesting about the way that these kingdoms divided themselves geographically is that their culture appears to linger today in their respective area of predominance. For example, the Koguryu kingdom in the north was highly militaristic and pursued an expansionist foreign policy, such that by the 5th century they were actually able to conquer South Korean territory and establish a temporary unification of the peninsula. You can obviously see the parallels here with modern-day North Korea, and I would argue that a historical nationalism undoubtedly plays a role in the North Korean mindset today. A lot happened over the next several centuries, but the gist of it is that the Korean Peninsula spent much of its history dealing with internal conflict between kingdoms, while also having to repel foreign invasions from the Chinese, the Mongols, the Japanese, and others. It did also experience lengthy periods of unification, most notably under the Koryo and Chosun dynasties. Now, during the 19th century, under the Joseon dynasty, the Koreans adopted a strict isolationist policy and was actually referred to as the Hermit Kingdom. The problem is that, at the same time, it was crippled by severe poverty and government corruption, leaving itself vulnerable to imperial rule, which eventually happened under the Japanese. Here again, we have a striking parallel with contemporary events. North Korea keeps propagating a protectionist foreign policy while its people are starving, and much like how the Joseon dynasty of the past was forced to bend the knee to imperialists, I predict that the North Koreans will soon fall as well in a similar fashion and be ruled by a proxy in some sort of neo-imperialistic manner by big players in the world stage, whether that be China, the United States, other people, or a combination of states. From 1910 through World War II, the Japanese ruled the Korean Peninsula with a brutal genocidal policy in which thousands of Koreans were killed, hundreds of thousands of men were forced into manual labor, while women suffered sexual slavery. An attempt was also made to eradicate Korean heritage by both destroying and exporting cultural artifacts. Koreans saw their language suppressed, they were forced to take on Japanese surnames. It's one of the lesser-known genocides that took place in human history, one of many, unfortunately. But like I mentioned near the beginning of this video, after the Second World War, the Korean Peninsula was partitioned into the North and South, serving as Cold War proxies for the Soviets and Americans. This is when Kim Il-sung, or Great Leader as he would later be called, took power. His background's actually very elusive, but a few things are certain. First, he grew up during the height of Japanese abuse in the Korean Peninsula and developed a resounding hatred towards imperialism that was only matched by his admiration of communism. He associated himself with several communist guerrilla groups and gained enough infamy that he was placed on a Japanese wanted list and driven out of Korea into the Soviet Union. Interestingly, he actually served as a major in the Red Army until the end of World War II. He only returned to Korea in 1945 after over a quarter of a century in exile. It's actually quite interesting because he became a symbol of Korean nationalism, but upon his initial return, he was considered to be a foreigner in his own land. He had barely sufficient mastery of the Korean language. Pretty quickly, though, the Soviets supported his rise to power and his role as the spearhead of communism in Korea. By 1949, he had obtained complete control of the North and a devout following of its citizens. It may seem remarkable that the North Koreans were so hasty to embrace a communist totalitarian regime, but remember that for the past 4 decades, they were oppressed and humiliated by the Japanese occupation, and Kim Il-sung effectively portrayed himself as the savior of the North Korean people. He was able to do this with Soviet-style propaganda in which visual arts and statues played a huge role. There's actually a great book called Totalitarian Art, which explores the distinctive art style that tends to develop in totalitarian regimes and how it's used for political purposes to bolster national approval. If you think of some prominent dictatorships, such as Nazi Germany under Hitler or Stalin's Soviet Union, even Mussolini or modern-day Iran, if you think about some of the art emerging from those settings, there are common themes. You'll often see smiling working-class people in the farming fields and mines, or totalitarian leaders surrounded by joyful, smiling children, or images of an extremely disciplined military. Anyways, that's beside the point. The point is that because of decades of Japanese oppression, Kim Il-sung was able to effect Soviet-style propaganda to solidify total control of North Korea through a cult of personality. Then in 1950, he invaded South Korea, and that war was just a giant clusterfuck that accomplished absolutely nothing. Kim Il-sung temporarily conquered Seoul, then the Americans got involved and captured Pyongyang, then the Chinese felt threatened and pushed back, and this went on back and forth until finally a ceasefire was called and a state division was drawn at nearly the same exact border that existed prior to the North's aggression. Over 1 million people died for nothing. And again, I can't help but draw the parallel here between Kim Il-sung's actions and that of the militaristic northern kingdom of Goguryeo in the distant past. Perhaps Great Leader fantasized about a glorious North Korean past and propagated that history to drive intense nationalism and promote obedience. After the war, Kim Il-sung started to implement economic reforms and purge the country of any and all opposition that became apparent. He also debuted his ideology of Chuche and allowed it to dictate policy. Policies that remain to this day and are ultimately responsible for North Korea's failure to thrive, but I'll talk about that more in a little bit. The rest of Kim Il-sung's rule was mostly uneventful, beside his occasional attempts to covertly assassinate participants in South Korean leadership and a slow development of a nuclear research program. It seems, though, that Great Leader may have been seasoned with a little bit of wisdom towards the end of his days because he actually agreed to halt the nuclear research program at the personal request of Jimmy Carter. Unfortunately, this was the same year that he died and was succeeded by Kim Jong-il in 1994. Fun fact about Kim Jong-il, by the way, his real name was actually Yuri Isernovich Kim. Remember that his father lived in the Soviet Union for years and was an officer in the Red Army. Kim Jong-il was actually born in the Soviet Union. Anyways, I just think it's interesting how nationalistic the state of North Korea is. Yet their first two rulers, Great Leader and Dear Leader, the same ones who promote this hardcore Korean nationalism, were basically foreigners. So it was actually Kim Jong-il who aggressively pursued the policy of developing a nuclear weapon. It came out in 2002 that he had been developing them in the time since his father agreed to put a stop to the program, and then in 2006, he claimed to have successfully conducted his first underground nuclear test. And there is some evidence gathered by US and Korean intelligence to corroborate the claim. Obviously, the policy of nuclear development was kicked into overdrive by Kim Jong-un, the current dictator, as he tries to consolidate power and makes a desperate bid to keep his pathetic regime relevant. The nuclear capabilities of North Korea are very limited according to international intelligence, though. It's estimated that he has only maybe a dozen primitive weapons. More importantly, though, the North Koreans don't appear to have an effective way to deliver those bombs. They have been unable to miniaturize their nuclear warheads, and so at this point, they would basically have to drop one out of an airplane World War II style instead of putting one on a missile. A mission such as that would never be successful with the world's eyes on them. So you can stop listening to all the fear-mongering about North Korea using nuclear weapons because they won't. A much more terrifying scenario, based on reality, is a barrage of artillery striking the South Korean capital of Seoul. It's ultimately a suicide mission for the North, but from a military analysis standpoint, it's the most likely scenario for a preemptive strike. It's also the most likely scenario for a retaliatory aggression. At this point, the totalitarian regime knows that it will never be able to reunify the peninsula. The main goal of the Kim dynasty is to maintain power and harness international recognition of the regime as sovereign. The most effective way to accomplish this purely from a militaristic standpoint is to carpet bomb Seoul with incessant rocket fire and leverage a similar fate to other heavily populated South Korean cities. If they are lucky, they may be able to secure a hastily written treaty drafted by Western powers to spare the lives of hundreds of thousands before they are able to put an end to the barrage through their counterattacks. If this sounds like a terrible plan, it's because it is. But it's all that the North Koreans have from a militaristic standpoint. What I'm trying to say here is that they have run out of options and change is imminent. The emphasis on nuclear weapons is just propaganda, and that brings me to a very important contextual argument. The problem with North Korea is that it has been grossly mismanaged. It continues to prioritize military development and pursue self-reliance while also promoting an economic policy of isolation. This ideology was first promoted by Kim Il-sung, and he called it chuche, or self-reliance. It's a weird and unnatural mix of ethnic nationalism with communism that emphasizes military might, obedience to the state, and economic protectionism. Through this philosophy, the Kim dynasty has sought to shun the outside world and ultimately erase external reliance. At first, this was accomplished with economic partnerships with Eastern Bloc countries such that Kim Il-sung focused the development of North Korea on its industry. The North Korean mountains are very rich in mineral resources, particularly coal and iron, for which he heavily invested in infrastructure development. With export revenue, the North Korean economy actually flourished, vastly outpacing the economy of South Korea during its first 2 decades. But remember, the Kim dynasty's ultimate goal is one of self-reliance. It then makes no sense that the leadership developed an export-driven economy and neglected its agricultural sector. Every country is a slave to its geography, and North Korea finds itself in a very mountainous landscape covered in snow for much of the year, such that only about 20% of its land is suitable for agriculture and often only yields 1 crop per year. It will be very difficult to feed the country's population without relying on other world market imports. Like I said originally, they relied on Eastern Bloc food imports in order to extract mineral wealth from the mountains, and in doing so, they completely ignored the food demands of a growing population. One way that a state can maximize crop yield is to utilize farming techniques introduced by the Green Revolution, such as advanced irrigation techniques, mechanization, agrochemical development, hybridization, and seed selection. And while most other places in the world experienced an agricultural boom due to these practices in the 50s and 60s, North Korea neglected it, and they paid the price for it in the 90s. The way they dealt with initial food shortages was not to improve farming methods, but instead, in typical communist fashion, to force the little peasants to toil longer hours in the fields. There were other gross incompetencies and mismanagement that occurred in the subsequent decades, such as borrowing huge amounts of money from the Europeans and defaulting on the loans, destroying their credibility in the eyes of investors, or undertaking huge wasteful projects of building skyscrapers and stadiums, most of which were failures or were never even completed. Most people with a high school education could have governed North Korea better. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, the North Koreans lost a major trading partner almost overnight, such that export revenue collapsed and food imports stagnated. With the fall of communism, the North Koreans finally got what they wanted: isolation through their doctrine of Chuche. Now they were truly alone, and they had to face the reality of the inefficiencies of self-reliance. Because of mismanagement and a focus on the mineral industry while neglecting agro-development, the totalitarian state was completely unprepared to handle their so-desired isolation. For a while there, China tried to fill the role of the former Soviet Union and was supplying North Korea with about 70% of its food imports and a similar percentage of its energy needs, but they too experienced a grain shortage in the early 90s and were forced to cut off aid to the North Koreans. You can see where this is going. The 1990s was marked by death and famine. We here in the West call it by what it is, the North Korean famine of the 1990s, but over there they had to call it the arduous march, because calling it anything else would imply that the government bore responsibility, and that would get you a death sentence, which honestly might have been better. I have no doubt that some Koreans at the time prayed for a bullet to the head rather than having to face one more day of starvation or seeing their child disintegrate into skin and bones. We like to envision a post-apocalyptic world and what it would look like, and I imagine it would be something like what happened during the famine. Emancipated zombies stumbling through empty towns, scurrying for food, and probably eating each other in some cases. This was all made worse by catastrophic flooding that occurred at the height of the arduous march in the mid-90s. It was the worst flood in 70 years and inundated about a third of the country, destroying not only farmlands but also stores of already harvested grain and energy sector infrastructure. It got so bad that the North Korean leadership had to throw all principle of Chuche out the door and beg the free world for humanitarian aid. The United States was sending hundreds of thousands of tons of food to the starving Koreans. Imagine this today. Imagine this. Imagine if all of a sudden Kim Jong-un stopped talking about vaporizing the United States and its allies and instead begged them for food. That's what the situation in the 90s basically led to. Of course, the leadership never starves, though. Can you picture pudgy little Kim Jong-un going one day without food? No, he wouldn't let that happen. His people could all be starving to death, and he'd probably be laughing and stuffing his fat face with kimchi and fried rice. It's actually funny. I started randomly streaming the North Korean state television channel the other day out of curiosity, and they were broadcasting a state-sponsored agricultural science documentary talking about the pH of soil and nitrogen cycling and all that shit. So you can see how much they regret their agricultural neglect of the past, and at least they have learned not to repeat it. Now, why do I go off on a tangent and bring up all of these past events? It's to highlight North Korea's total dependence on outside states for its survival. The only reason the rogue regime is allowed to exist is because it is economically supported by China. If the Chinese were to withdraw their support, North Korea would collapse overnight. About 90% of North Korea's external trade in 2013 occurred with China. Nobody else is stupid enough to engage with them and risk the ire of the United States. If China were to stop sending food to North Korea, the latter would starve. And if the Chinese stopped buying North Korean iron and coal, Kim Jong-un's coffers would run dry, crippling the economy and the military. It's becoming more and more apparent that China has started to realize that it can no longer engage with the North Koreans. It's a sinking ship, and they are looking for a way out. The problem is, they must break off relations with Kim Jong-un from a position of strength. If they bend the knee to American demands and threats, it demeans their position on the global stage. The Chinese no longer rely on North Korean coal and iron. It's inconsequential to them at this point. They have built up a tremendous mineral industry in East Africa, reminiscent of the age of colonialism. Similarly, they have expanded their agricultural development to Australia and New Zealand. Even from a geopolitical strategy standpoint, the Korean Peninsula has become much less important to the Chinese over the past several years. It does share a border with them, and they would like to protect their interests by avoiding having a United States ally as a neighbor, but they have vastly increased their influence in the South China Sea and seem to be focusing their geopolitical efforts there, making the Korean Peninsula at least a little bit less important to them. It has become too inefficient and too dangerous for the Chinese to keep holding Kim Jong-un's leash. I think that they have realized this long ago and have been planning an exit strategy that will allow them to continue looking strong on the world stage while abandoning a former ally in a geopolitically important area. Most people who are not well read on this topic insist that a conflict with North Korea will inevitably lead to war with China, but I'm here to tell you that that will never happen. The Chinese most certainly would not risk a war with the United States, As it stands, their economy is not built for war. China is a paper palace. Modi's India is much more poised to become the Asian superpower of the next decade. China's economy is restrained by dependence on exports to its competitors, such that the United States Navy and trade sanctions from a Western alliance would choke China's war efforts very rapidly. Not to mention all the ethnic separatists within China who would exploit the opportunity to gain influence. Think of the Tibetans in Western China, or the Mongolians and Uyghurs in the Northwest. They even have jihadis in the east. The entire eastern coast of China is dominated by secessionist-leaning minorities, to the point where the Chinese government has to pour in billions of dollars every year just to keep the region stable. No, the last thing that the Chinese want is a war, and I don't think they would risk their own collapse to protect the madman Kim Jong-un. This is not even theoretical anymore. Just yesterday, they rejected a cargo of North Korean coal. What sort of message do you think that sends to Kim Jong-un and the rest of the world? After hearing everything I just talked about, you should be able to recognize this as a monumental event with monumental implications. It's the first tangible indication that China is finished with North Korea. It's only a matter of time. Do you think that it's a coincidence that this move comes at the back of a 2-day meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping and Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago? I don't believe in coincidence. Donald Trump is a businessman. He understands that North Korea is only permitted to exist because the Chinese feed them and fuel their economy. And he understands that the most effective way to collapse Kim Jong-un's regime is to halt that flow of resources. Like I just said, China needs the United States to buy its poorly produced shit in order to drive its economy. Xi Jinping is not going to risk a trade war only so that they can keep feeding fat boy Kim Jong-un dumplings. They have been looking for an exit strategy from the Korean Peninsula, and an opportunity may have just landed on their laps. Additionally, the Chinese have just mobilized 150,000 troops along the North Korean border. The official story circulating is that the presence is there to curtail the flow of North Korean refugees as tensions continue to escalate, but 150,000 men is a huge force. They may be there only to send a message or as an indication of a willingness to cooperate with the military action against Kim Jong-un. My opinion, though, is that they may have been moved there in an anticipatory capacity. What I mean by that is the Chinese may be anticipating an imminent collapse of the totalitarian regime, whether that be through diplomacy, external military action, or an internal coup. Xi Jinping wants to have a significant force in the area to protect China's geopolitical interests in a period of political instability that follows every regime change. Donald Trump has also stepped up his public rhetoric against Kim Jong-un, threatening unilateral action, and this time he has backed it up with the symbolic strikes on Syria days prior. Now, I don't think he will take unilateral action, at least not without the blessing of some of his allies. He threatened this days before meeting with Xi Jinping, indicating that it was a negotiation opener. He was projecting a message to encourage the Chinese to become more aggressive with Kim Jong-un, and then, while the head of the Chinese state was sleeping under Donald Trump's own roof at Mar-a-Lago, the president quickly and decisively flexed his muscles to the world with the Syrian airstrikes. I guarantee you that if Xi Jinping was not listening on North Korea prior to this, he is now. Again, it is no coincidence that days after his visit, he has moved troops to the Korean border and rejected a shipment of Korean coal. This all comes as the United States Navy moves more strike groups to the Korean Peninsula, and other regional leaders like the Prime Minister of Japan call for the solution of the North Korean problem. Yesterday, Donald Trump again tweeted that if the Chinese will not handle their rabid bulldog Kim Jong-un, the United States will do it for them. He also bribed them with favorable trade deals. Xi Jinping is certainly taking these threats seriously, as evidenced by the military movements and reconsideration of trade deals with North Korea. Ideally, the Chinese would withdraw all support and all economic bolstering of the regime, forcing Kim Jong-un to the negotiating table, or forcing an ambitious North Korean to depose of the lunatic once and for all. It's the only way to avoid a military conflict at this point, and not outside the realm of possibility. The Chinese have shown their willingness to play ball, and hopefully they continue along this trajectory. The end may be closer than we think. April 15th is the anniversary of Kim Il-sung's birthday, and the North Koreans have traditionally gathered around this date to display military might to the world and propagate nationalism. Do they have something planned for great leader's birthday in a few days? Kim Jong-un has extremely limited options at this point. His economy is imploding and another famine is imminent, especially with indications that the Chinese are withdrawing economic support. If he orders military action, the conflict will be bloody and short, and his regime will be utterly decimated on top of thousands of needlessly lost lives. If he agrees to de-escalate his nuclear weapons program, the dictator will be viewed as weak and open himself up to an internal coup. And if he does nothing, the chances are high that the United States and its allies, with or without the support of the Chinese, will topple the regime either way. Like I said in the beginning of this video, Kim Jong-un is backed into a corner. He is alone and without allies. Someone is now forced to make a move. My concern is that because of his lack of options, he may choose to do something heroically suicidal. I hope it doesn't come to that, but I assure you, the days of his regime are numbered. April 15th is certainly a date to watch out for, but he may last longer if he does not act irrationally. One thing I will predict with confidence though, Kim Jong-un will not die a natural death.